that I gave that responsibility to Corey Sawyers. And what Corey has done in taking that particular class is something that has amazed me and impressed me. He had another session, which if you were unable to be in that session, you need to read the manuscript and get the audio, because he talked about learning to love the Psalms. And the thing that impressed me about that particular lecture and about Corey is it wasn't just a topic, it was reality. He really does love the Psalms, and what he has done in his own life in preaching the Psalms and teaching the Psalms is something that I've just really admired. The students are greatly blessed to have Corey teaching them the Psalms. And so I'm encouraged on the work he does, and I know that we're going to be blessed to hear him give us another talk. Corey is the preacher for the church in Martin, Tennessee. He has been there for a couple of years, but prior to that, he was here with us as a teacher and in the development department. And so I've had the privilege of working with Corey on a day-to-day basis, and also have had the honor of being there in Martin and seeing the ministry situation that Corey is in. And he is doing a terrific job. One thing that I'll tell a real quick story, and not use up too much of his time, but the church in Martin suffered a very tragic death of one of its ministers, their campus minister. And when you are in ministry and you have a death like that, that so greatly impacts your congregation, it's one of those jobs that no one would want. And Corey was one that handled it in such an amazing and beautiful way that, the Bible teaches us in 2 Corinthians that God is the God of all comfort. Well, God provided comfort to a hurting congregation through the words of Corey. And he did such a masterful job of navigating and helping a congregation get through that. And I've admired him before that event, but have appreciated and admired him even more after that. The level of work and sensitivity and time and thought that he put into how to approach that really showed a lot about this man and the heart that he has. And so anyway, I think that his love of the Psalms probably helped him in dealing with that particular tragedy that happened at Martin. And so anyway, without further delay, Corey, come preach the word.
First, let me say how much I appreciate getting to be here and to be a part of this lectureship, to be here at Bear Valley. That means so much to me. And Denny's right. I had Denny as an instructor for the Wisdom Literature books, and I teach them now. I tell the students every time that this really is a 2 Timothy 2:2 class, which we talk about a lot. He taught it to me, I'm teaching to them, and we expect them to go out and teach it to others. And I hadn't really planned on talking about that, but it wasn't really my words that we made it through that time of losing Jared. We actually turned to the Psalms is where we turned to. We typically, on the first Sunday of the year, I will preach a lesson on unveiling our congregational theme for the year. And I just felt like that first Sunday, we didn't need to be preached at, we needed to pray together. And so we actually went through 3 different Psalms and talked about them and prayed as a congregation together with those Psalms. So he's right, I love them. I'm honored to get to teach them because they meant so much to Denny, and I learned so much from him. I'm honored to teach them because, though, of how impactful they can be, and I think you've seen that in the lessons that we've had delivered to us over the last couple of days. The 107th Psalm is the one that we're going to talk about today. We're also going to reference Psalm 105 and 106 a little bit at the beginning. So if you open up your Bibles there, you'll be able to see all of that. Psalm 107 was a particularly favorite psalm of the Puritans that we would call the Pilgrims that came over on the Mayflower seeking religious freedom in the New World. Psalm 107 has been called the Pilgrim's Psalm from time to time, and it's done so because it was one that they used very often on their trip over across the Atlantic Ocean. It was one they used in their worship service before they got off the boat when they made it to the New World. And it's one that later on, when the governor began to write a detail of kind of what they went through, it's very evident. He not only mentioned Psalm 107, but he basically used Psalm 107 as an outline of the speech that he wrote, detailing what they went through. It is a beautiful and wonderful psalm, and one of my favorites. I can't put anything Tennessee Vols related up here, Denny, after yesterday, but I got to thinking about, I don't know about you, how many of you are college football fans or football fans, sports fans even, but I know you get the idea of what it means to be hitting rock bottom. And Tennessee's been at rock bottom for a while now, but I think Colorado, I'm not making fun of Colorado fans, but I think Colorado fans would agree that last year was about rock bottom. I mean, it was pretty painful to watch the Colorado Buffaloes play football last year. Not only could they not stop anyone, they couldn't score on anyone, and on a 1-11 season ended up with their firing their head coach, and they eventually hired Deion Sanders, Coach Prime. And of course, he had his introductory press conference. We're coming, he told you. He went into the locker room and told the players there that some of you probably need to find somewhere else to play football because you're not playing for me. He was making radical changes, and everyone kind of looked with interest to see what was going to happen in Colorado, what was going to take place with the Buffalo football team. Well, you've seen the results, of course, already a top 25 upset victory on the road. They've had last night beating a rivalry, a 3-0 record. They're in the top 25 all week long. You couldn't turn on ESPN without being reminded that ESPN is focused on Boulder, Colorado, and the University of Colorado and Coach Prime and what's going on. The change has really been phenomenal. My brother and I were talking about it the other night, and he was mentioning the fact that it's really been unreal how quickly they've turned it around. And we made mention the fact that probably 3-4 years ago that wouldn't have been possible without the transfer portal and some other things. But if you watch the team this year play, it's daylight and dark. It's like, other than the uniforms, there's nothing that looks similar to last year's football team. That kind of change is amazing. But the reality is there's things in our lives far more important than even college football. Times in which we hit rock bottom. And it's in those moments especially that we ought to turn to the Psalms. That we ought to realize that these are men of God that are, as they've hit rock bottom so many times, are looking how do we develop our relationship and grow in our relationship. They'll pray prayers that sometimes we're uncomfortable reading out loud. If we were standing next to them as they prayed, we might have taken a giant step to the side to have not have been struck by the lightning bolt. But they're real and they're honest with the way they feel because they recognize that God would change everything. We're looking at this psalm, Psalm 107, that's the first and the fifth book of the Psalms. And I love, sometimes whenever congregations will ask me to host a gospel meeting for them, if they don't have anything in mind for me to preach, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll preach through the Psalms. All of the Psalms are impactful and all of them are powerful, but I think especially the first Psalm in each of the 5 books are particularly impactful. And so I'll preach a lesson kind of overviewing the Psalms, and then we'll do one on Psalm 1, and we'll talk about the choice that you have to make between righteousness or the way of wickedness. We talk about from Psalm 42 and 43 because they really kind of belong together. If you study them, you'll see the repeated chorus in them. And we'll talk about hope. We sing the song sometimes, "As the deer pants for the water," but we don't really know that comes from the Psalms. And it's a really desperate plea that he has. But in the chorus, he reminds himself that he has hope in God. Book 3 of 73 that Denny mentioned earlier today is one of Michael's favorites. I've heard him preach on, and it's one of mine, where Asaph he says, my feet are about to slip because his faith has been so rocked in that he looks around and he sees all of these evil people having bad things happen to him, or good things happen to them, and nothing but bad happens to him as he tries to live for the Lord, until he went to the house of the Lord and gained God's perspective on life and what it was really all about. And then Psalm 90 is the psalm written by Moses, where he talks about eternity, and he talks about the brevity of life and the reality of death, and how we need to make decisions based on having that kind of mindset of keeping in mind that our time here on earth is temporary, and we need to make decisions based on the reality of death and ultimately the fact that we'll stand before God in judgment. And then we come to book 5, Psalm 107, that begins a book that is dominated by songs of praise. And this is a psalm that begins praising God. And actually it continues a thought that is begun in Psalm 105 and 106. And the idea that we're going to talk about this morning, or this afternoon rather, is that God changes everything. He changes everything. The fifth book of the Psalms is written in a time put together, looking at a time in which the children of Israel have come back from the exile. There's a time for a funeral song, and there's a time for a happy song. And it's a time for celebration, and it's a time for joy. And that's reflected in this book, and particularly in this psalm that begins this fifth book of the Psalms. And as the writer begins this book, he's kind of carrying on a thought process that began back in Psalm 105. Psalm 105, Psalm 106, and Psalm 107 are all historical psalms. And we'll talk a little bit in just a moment about what he's doing with each of those three psalms. But they're all pointed towards God in praise to Him, and particularly telling about their thanksgiving to God. Let me tell you a little bit about the structure of Psalm 107, and then we'll get into the meat of the lesson. Actually, if you'll notice in verse 1, you've got this idea in this introduction of the psalm that lasts the first three verses, where he says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever." Give thanks to the Lord because of His steadfast love. If you'll look back one chapter into Psalm 106, you'll see that's almost the same identical way that he began Psalm 106, thanking God for His steadfast love. If you look back at Psalm 105, he'll talk about praising God and giving thanks to God because of the faithfulness of God. And as he gets into this particular psalm, he's going to repeat that idea of thanking God for His steadfast love over and over. In fact, if you go down through Psalm 107, you'll notice that 4 different times there's this repeated chorus or refrain, we would call it in our songbooks, that's almost verbatim, exactly, "Let them thank the Lord for His steadfast love, for His wondrous works to the children of men." We're thanking God. In fact, this idea of thanking God is one of those 5 words in the Hebrew language that the psalmist will use to show their praise to God. This is the third most used one, and it's a word that is most times in our English translations it's rendered as give thanks or thanksgiving or something of that nature. When you think about, we sing the song, "Count Your Blessings, Name Them One by One." When we have Thanksgiving meals and we say our prayers of thanksgiving, what we're in essence doing is praising God for all of those things that He's done for us, and that's what they're doing in Psalm 107. In particular, though, they're focusing on His steadfast love. Now, at the very end of the psalm, the last refrain is just a little bit different, but he still talks about this remembering the steadfast love of the Lord. And so the refrain kind of divides up the psalm for us. And as we talk about it, we're going to notice these 5 pictures that he paints for us from when we hit rock bottom, how that God changes everything. Now, it doesn't mean that God takes away the suffering we go through. It doesn't mean that God takes away our problems, but He certainly changes everything in our perspective and in our hope and in our view of what we're dealing with. And so let's begin by noticing this introduction. He says, "Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever." Now, when you think about what he's been doing, the psalmist has been doing, what the Lord has been doing through them. In Psalm 105, you'll notice at the beginning of that psalm, he talks a lot about covenant. And he'll talk about how that God is a God of covenant. And he had made a covenant with Abraham. He had made a covenant with his people. And throughout Psalm 105, he's going to show how that God is always faithful. That God keeps his word. That when he made a covenant with the children of Israel, he entered into that covenant to keep it. And he always does. And he'll detail throughout the history of the children of Israel, as from Abraham up into leading them out of Egypt, how that over and over God was there to take care of them. How that he was faithful in keeping his end of the bargain. How that he was faithful in taking care of them and bringing them through whatever it was that was going on. In Psalm 106, again, he begins with this idea of thanking God for his steadfast love. And this idea of steadfast love, it's a broad Hebrew word. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I can just tell you it's a broad Hebrew word. It can carry the idea of grace or of kindness or love or mercy, or lots of different kind of ideas can come from it. But steadfast love is a really good way to put it, in particular in light of Psalm 105 and his talking about God keeping his covenant. God's going to keep his covenant. But in Psalm 106, he reminds them that they've sinned, and he details from the wandering in the wilderness on down to the current days of all of the sins that they had committed, how they had not kept their end of the bargain. But he reminds them that God is a God of covenant, that God is a God of steadfast love. And so he's asking God to be faithful and to remember them in his faithfulness. So Psalm 105 is God has always been faithful. Psalm 106 is God be faithful. And you'll notice that at the end of Psalm 106, he's making this plea to God. We know we're going to go into exile. We're going to be carried away into captivity. He'd been warning them that for decades. But bring us back together is our plea. Bring us back into the promised land. Let us be your people again. And because God is faithful, we know he's going to. So God was faithful. God, please be faithful. And then 107 is thank God that he's still faithful. He just is. His steadfast love is the reason that he's done that. So let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble and gathered in the lands from all directions, wherever they might have been carried off to or been repopulated in, or maybe some of them had escaped on their own. Now God is bringing them all back. And so now it's a time of celebration. And the celebration is not just a national holiday. It's not just a time for us to watch football and eat some turkey. It's not a time to pull out the sale papers and say, what are we going to buy tomorrow on Black Friday? This is a thanksgiving, a praising God for what he has done for us. And what we're going to notice as we go through the rest of this chapter, this is the 7th longest psalm, by the way, and I would complain if it weren't for the fact that Michael's preaching Psalm 119 right now. But nonetheless, at the remainder of our time, we're going to look at 5 different pictures that he gives us of what God has done for us and reasons that we should praise God, that we should thank God, that he changes everything. The first picture that he paints for us is the fact that God changes, there it goes, the Lord changes everything, that God changes desert to city. Now when we think about wilderness or desert, country living, but I always would say when we lived out in Denver, I hate to brag, but I was raised in the country. I hate to brag that way, but I just was, you know. And it's good to be, we miss Bear Valley and we miss the congregation, we miss the work, but it is good to be back in a place where I go through one stoplight instead of 28 to get to work. That's really nice. We complain sometimes living in the country that we don't have my wife misses the fact that there were within an easy drive any kind of store that she wanted here. That's not the case in Martin. In fact, I was talking to a brother on Friday and he said, you know, we're fixing to come visit y'all when we're going to go to Tennessee, and we thought we'd swing by and see you. And I said, you don't just swing by and see us. You're either intending on making it to Martin or you're really lost when you get to Martin. But nonetheless, there's good, and you might prefer living in a big city, or you might prefer living in a country, but in the days of the Psalms, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about being in a wilderness. We're talking about being in a place where food and water and shelter was not readily available, where they were wandering around without well laid out roads, maybe without a sense of direction. It was easy to get lost. Where it was hard, they had to scrounge to find anything to eat or to drink. They would have to look for places in which they could find shelter from the extremities that they would face, where there was robbers and bad guys littered throughout that was waiting to take advantage of them. But in the cities was the places where that there was food and water readily available, that there was protection from the city walls, that there was blessings involved. And so we'll spend a little bit more time on this one than we will the other, because you'll see the structure repeats, especially in the first four in particular. But notice he says some. Now that word that's translated some is not really in the original text. It just is, they wondered. It's an understood kind of a noun there that is the subject of that sentence. But the idea is that it's not everyone. He's going to talk about who he's talking about, the sons of men, humanity. The idea is that with all of these pictures he's going to paint, you may not be in every one of these situations, but at some point in time, you're going to be in at least one of them. And I would dare say in all of these that we're going to talk about, there's a really good chance that maybe someone here today, each one of these you've experienced at some point in your life. So some, he says, wandered in a desert. And then in each of these, he's going to explain how bad a situation it was. They were hungry. They were thirsty. Their soul fainted. They were as bad as things could be. And that's the way he'll paint it each and every time, of how terribly that things had gotten for them. And it wasn't until they hit rock bottom. And isn't it sad that we wait until we hit rock bottom to turn to the Lord? But we do, don't we? But when they hit rock bottom, when they realize that things aren't going the way that I need them to or want them to, when I realize I need change, I know that it's the Lord that I've got to turn to for that change. So in every one of these, it'll tell us that then they cried to the Lord in their trouble and their distress. They finally realized that we're out here wandering in the wilderness. We're out here lost. We don't have the things we need. But God is the one that can give us direction in our lives. And notice that in each one of these, not only will he tell about how bad things are, but after they call to the Lord, he'll describe for us how good things get. And as bad as they were, they're that good once the Lord enters the picture. It is a complete 180-degree turn. It is from as dark as things could be to as bright as things could be. So notice, it's always the exact opposite. So they were hungry and thirsty. Their soul fainted. They didn't have a place to dwell in. Now they have a place to dwell in. Now with the Lord, their soul is satisfied. The hungry soul has been filled. They've turned to God. They were wandering lost. But then they turned to God. And then they had the blessings that they need. Have you ever been lost? It's a little bit easier now that we have GPS on our phones and that kind of thing, but I can remember several times being lost, especially before we had GPSs and whatnot. There's a place that we like to go squirrel hunting back home. It's out between Sharon in the middle of nowhere, basically, and it's called Etheridge's Levee. It's a wildlife managed area. It's a really big woods down by the Middle Fork of the Obion River, and when I was a boy growing up, I was always told these stories about how that there were teenagers at different times that had gone squirrel hunting down at Etheridge's Levee that got lost and they never found them and they never found their bodies. And I don't know if that really happened or if that was just the old men's way of making us stay where we were supposed to stay and not wandering off, But I remember when I was about 15 or 16 years old, there was about 3 or 4 older guys, and me and my buddy Jamie were the same age, that were out squirrel hunting on opening day. And I'm in my little area that I'm supposed to be in, and I see a squirrel. But he's always about one branch ahead of me. I'd work around and try to get to where I had a clear shot, and about the time I would, he'd jump. And I kept following that rascal all the way through them woods, so I finally got him. And I went over and picked him up, and I put him in the back of my vest, and I turned around, and I had no idea where I was at. And guess what the first thing that I thought of was? That's the end of Corey. They're not even going to find me to know I killed the squirrel, you know. Isn't that the way we do sometimes, though? Is that we're chasing after whatever it is we think we need to chase after, or focusing on what we want to focus on, and all the while we are lost and getting more and more deep into being lost and don't realize it. And when we turn around and look up, we realize just how bad things are. But praise be to God that He doesn't leave us in that lost situation. The second one that He tells us about is that God changes slavery to freedom because the Lord changes everything. So notice He talks about they're in darkness, they're in shadow of death, they're prisoners in affliction and iron, they have hard labor. He paints this picture of them being in a prison cell, and He uses iron and brass, which is the two hardest metals that they had in ancient days. It's a hopeless situation. There's hard labor. They're bound. They can't escape. They're in a position where they can't rescue themselves. They can't get themselves to freedom, to where they want to be. And when they realize how badly their situation is, then they cried to the Lord in their trouble and distress. And as bad as things were, God changed everything. And so He brought them out of darkness, out of the shadow of death. He tore their bonds apart. He broke open the doors and cut open the bars and allowed them to have the freedom that they could not give themselves, because God changes everything. You know, sin's that way, isn't it? How many times does the Bible picture for us the idea of sin or wickedness being that of slavery? You think about, I read a story happened in 1989. There was a couple of young men, one 16 and one 18, who was involved in a robbery at a convenience store in Lake Spur, California. And the guy pushed the alarm. They take off running. Here comes the cops after them. They don't know what to do, so they're trying to evade being arrested. They get to a point as they're running down this little area here, and they come across a big, tall chain link fence. And the cops are in the car, so they think this is the way to escape. They climb the fence and get over, only to realize that chain link fence was the outer perimeter of San Quentin prison. In their efforts to fix their situation on their own, what they had done is put themselves in bondage. Isn't that what sin does to us? It promises us an escape. It promises us freedom. It promises us happiness. It promises, give us the things that we really want. But all it does is end up shackling and chaining us, whether it's pornography or addiction to some chemical or alcohol or whatever it might be, whether it's the relationships that we destroy. Sin promises great things, but all it does is bind us. It puts us in terrible situations. And we can't get out of it. We never think that I'll be the one that'll be addicted, that I'll be the one that will get caught, that I'll be the one that can't give it up anytime I want to. Until we look up and find out that we've hit rock bottom. Praise be to God that He didn't leave us in the slavery, in the chains and bondage of sin because of His steadfast love. The third picture He paints for us is that of sickness to health. So He'll talk about how that some, they're suffering affliction. They had gotten to the point that they didn't even want to eat anything. They're near the point of death. He says, and He tells us exactly why that they're having this happen to them. It's because of their sinful ways and their iniquities. Now, every sickness isn't caused by sin directly, but again, how many times does the Bible paint for us the idea of sin and sickness being joined together? And when they realized there was nothing that we could do with our situation that we're in, they cried to the Lord in their trouble and distress. And as bad as things were, He makes it all the more better. He healed them. He delivered them. And now they should give sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell of His deeds, because He's made everything better. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that if we have a terminal disease or we have cancer, we have some sort of sickness that is problematic. It doesn't mean that just because we pray to God that He's going to take away that sickness. But doesn't it change everything nonetheless? I mentioned this the other day in the chapel, but one of the great things about being in ministry, people want you there in the big moments of their life, and some of them are really great moments, and some of them are really the bottom. And the number of times that I've gone and visited good and godly men and women that are on their deathbed, that maybe are under hospice care, and I'm going there to encourage them, and I walk away in tears heading back to my vehicle as I leave, thinking, did I come here to encourage them or did they encourage me? How can you face death and sickness that way? Only with God. I don't know if you're familiar with this flower. It's been described as smelling like 3-day-old rotting corpses. You're ready to plant that in your garden now, right? It's actually called the corpse flower. It grows up to 10 feet tall, and if you'll notice kind of the flowering around the giant portion in the middle, it kind of even looks a little bit like flesh. But it's so big and it's so bright, it draws flies and other insects from all over. They can't help but see it, and as they see it, they think, look at this giant fly. This is like the smorgasbord of all flowers that we could eat at. And they go to it only to find that unlike any other flower that those flies or insects might land on, this one doesn't provide any nectar at all. It's nothing. It just smells really bad. And it usually only lasts about 3 days before it dies and withers away. What a perfect picture, though, of sin, isn't it? It promises us beauty. It promises us nourishment. It promises us so many things, and we get sucked into the trap only to realize that not only do we get anything that we want or need, it's made us really smelly. It's put us in a really bad situation. Maybe the sickness that he's talking about in this picture is literal physical ailments because of their sin, or maybe he's talking metaphorically about their spiritual sin, that spiritual sickness. But either way, isn't it wonderful to know that God doesn't leave us in those situations without hope? Praise be to God. Thank God that He doesn't leave us in those situations, but that He changes everything. The fourth picture is that God changes storm to peace because God changes everything. And the idea here that you're going to see is you have these sailors that they notice the deeds of the Lord and they're impressed by the deeds of the Lord, but they think we can go out and we can do what we want to do. And so they plot them a course in the sea, and of course in ancient times the sea was one that was considered kind of equivalent to, in some ways, death. It was violent, it was destructive, it was something that could not be controlled. And we're going to go out into the sea, we're going to plot our own course. What we're talking about here is people that are so self-assured, so full of their own direction, that I can do it my way, that it'll be okay. But notice what happens when we try to do it our way. He says that their courage melted among them, that they reeled and they staggered, that they were at their wits' end. It literally translated there is that their wisdom was swallowed up. Just like they were being swallowed up in the depths, their wisdom that they thought they had of I can do what I want to do was swallowed up. And in their distress, they cry out to the Lord. In their trouble, they cry out to the Lord. And notice how God changes everything. The storm became still. The wages of the sea were hushed. The waters were quieted. It reminds me of two accounts in the Bible that we see. First, when Jonah is there on the ocean, on the sea, with the sailors who undoubtedly had seen times of storm before, but they'd never experienced a great wind and a great storm like the Lord had brought on, and they were at their wits' end, did not know what to do, and they're crying out to their gods that brought them no help. Only the true and living God could in an instant make it perfectly calm. And then the account of Jesus on the storm at sea with the disciples, and how you have experienced fishermen on the boat that they don't know how to handle the waves and the wind that they're having to deal with. And Jesus, they wake him up in the boat asleep, and almost as if I'm taking a nap on my couch, and I look up at my little boys running around and say, "Hush up," and they would go. That's what the sea did. Jesus went, "Hush up," and the sea went, "Okay. Only God can do that. See, we get so caught up in our self-reliance and our self-assurance that we can figure it all out, that we think we don't need any help. And all we end up doing is digging ourselves a bigger hole, don't we? The story is told, I was hoping Wayne Berger would be in here for this session to hear this, but the story is told of a husband and wife that wanted to move to Maine, and so they bought this little cabin out in the woods, and from these two elderly sisters that had lived there for years and years. And as wintertime was coming on, the wife was a little bit concerned about the lack of insulation on the walls, and the husband said, if those two old women can live here, we certainly can, right? Until one night, the temperature plunged to well below zero, and they wake up the next morning, and their teeth are chattering, and they can't feel their extremities, and there's frost on the inside of the walls, and he's at his wit's end, so he calls these sisters, talks to them on the phone, and when he gets off the phone, his wife said, what did they say? He said, they told me that for 30 years, they went to Florida every winter. See, we think, well, I can do it. That's a very Western mindset, by the way, that I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps, that I can solve the problem, that I can fix it, that I don't need anyone, and yet God made us to need each other and to need Him. Thanks be to God that He doesn't leave us to our own devices to try to figure our way out, but God changes everything. And then the final picture is that God changes the fools to wise. And what is so foolish about what he's going to talk about here is the idea that they're trusting on material things. And he does this one. This is so much different than the other four. But notice kind of the way that he goes through this. He talks about He turns and He lets, and by His blessing He pours, He raises. This is God doing all this. But in the first section, he talks about turning plenty to poverty. And in the second section, poverty to plenty. Then in the third section, it's back to plenty to poverty. And the fourth section, poverty to plenty. See, we make all of our plans we get focused on building our bank account or what we're going to acquire or how we're going to live. Sometimes it's things that are so outside of our control. You can be a financial wizard, and things beyond your control, like a pandemic or like some kind of natural disaster or whatever, can totally wipe out your fortune. Those things aren't things to be trusted on. It's God that's to be trusted in. And over in the wisdom literature, that's what he reminds us that is the epitome of being a fool or being one who is wise. It's not about how much education you have. It's not about whose feet that you learn from. It's not about how many degrees you have on the wall. It's, are you humble enough to trust in God? Or are you going to try to do it your way and rely on the things of this life and this world? And so he gives us here the decision you have to make. The upright see it and are glad because they put their trust in the Lord, not in material things. The wickedness shuts its mouth. Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. Let him consider the steadfast love of the Lord, because that's all that really matters. You know, our cells, this is not Jeff Miller preaching now, so this is a very unscientific way to put this. But our cells kind of have this little slot, if you'll allow it, that is perfectly sized to allow a molecule of oxygen, O2, to enter into that cell, and that cell carries it through the body, and it uses it and whatnot, and it comes back and it gets replenished over and over. It's the perfect size for that little molecule of O2 to enter in. The problem is that when we look at a microscope at carbon monoxide, an atom of carbon, an atom of oxygen, it's almost identical in size and shape. And it'll fit right in that same slot in the cell. And so if you start breathing in carbon monoxide, it'll slip right into that little hole in your cell, and your body doesn't recognize that anything's happening. Because you're breathing in and out air. Your lungs are expanding and contracting. The cells are moving around. They've still got something in that little slot. But what you're doing the whole time is killing yourself. God made each and every one of us with a God-sized hole in our souls and in our lives. And we can try to fill that with a variety of things, but when we do, all we're really doing is killing ourselves. Because only He can really bring life. But the Lord changes everything. You know, one of the the things you can't hardly turn on television and scan through the channels without finding some sort of overnight change kind of show, right? Whether it's taking the worst house in the best neighborhood and transforming it in a few days' time to being a show place, or maybe it's one of those shows where we're going to make you healthier overnight, or we're going to make you look better. And so whether it's losing weight or repainting a house or redoing a car, or maybe it's putting in hair plugs and getting a nose job and new teeth, have you thought about if you could be on one of those shows and you could have some sort of fixer-up, what you would do? I've had bad teeth all my adult life. My dentist says I have the softest teeth he's ever seen. And I brush and I floss and I put fluoride on them and all this kind of stuff. And I can look at a piece of mashed potatoes and I'll break a tooth. And my wife's over there eating ice like, it's nobody's business and nothing. But I've thought about how cool would that be to have new teeth. But you know what would happen if I had new teeth? I always tell Melody if I got new teeth, what would happen is I'd walk out of the dentist's office, step out in front of a bus, and get killed by the bus, But I said, if that happens, when they put me in the casket, you make sure I have a big smile. I want everybody to see my new teeth. You can get a nose job, you can get hair plugs, but what are you going to have happen to your body eventually? It's going to deteriorate, isn't it? The house is going to break down. When I get back, I'm going to have waiting for me my first set of prescription glasses. I've been telling everybody, how food products has that best if used by date. I think I'm about to get to my best if used by date. But the changes that the Lord makes are eternal. And that's the difference. The Lord changes everything. And because He changes everything, then we need to recognize He is who we must turn to, and the Psalms are how we can do it. Now, I want to make this plea. There may be some in this room that you're one of those some. You're finding yourself in one of those situations. And you realize, I've hit rock bottom. I don't know where to turn. Turn to the Lord. Turn to the Psalms. If we can help you do that, we'd love to do that. But on a Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock when you'd rather be taking a nap or watching football, I'm going to guess most people in here has experienced that change. So you know what our responsibility should be? When we think about how faithful the Lord has been and how many times we ask Him to be faithful, Psalm 105 and Psalm 106, how could we not, when we see how He changes everything in our lives and in our marriages and in our relationships and in our outlooks, how could we not praise Him and thank Him for the steadfast love of the Lord? Psalm 107 reminds us that the Lord changes everything. If you've not let Him, let Him. But if you have, let's praise Him and let's thank Him and let's tell everyone about the steadfast love of the Lord that changes everything.